Good morning, everyone. The auditorium is open and already we are almost 130 people. It's a wonderful audience, although we don't see each other, but take a moment perhaps to imagine how that would look. For example, in Diona, it would be really let's say a full house. And that's a wonderful, I think, wonderful compliment also to our guest, who will be introduced in a few minutes after our game, Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, whom I'm sure nobody ever heard of. And great to see you. If you want, for all of us and for Charlotte, turn on your cameras for a minute or two to see each other, to wish each other, let's say, a good morning and a good session. Welcome, great to see you. Welcome to the session 8, right? Charlotte, session 8, very good number in Chinese numerical superstitions. So I'm sure it will be a good session. So let's start with, thank you for being here, and let's start immediately with our concept exercise. Metaxia will share with us the 2 concepts for the day, which are linking to the problematic of the talk.
So hello everyone from me. So indeed, even before introducing Charlotte, she's kind of introducing herself by giving you or choosing for you 2 words. So I'm sharing my screen. So the first word is field. So the ones of you with last names starting from A to M, you take a blue pen and the word field. And the next word is property. So the rest, starting from N to Z, you take a red pen and the word property. So as always, we give you 5 minutes starting from now to sketch on a, oh, I don't know how this worked, but someone sketched on my screen.
This is great. Perhaps you could sketch simultaneously while everybody else is sketching.
But yeah, I can. I just don't know how. I can try. Yeah, why not? Okay, I can do that. Anyhow, but you get 5 minutes to sketch those words. And at the end of the 5 minutes, we ask you to send a picture of the A4 white paper, Charlotte, to the WhatsApp group. And then I will share my screen, the WhatsApp group, and we can go through the sketches, commenting them together with Charlotte and Milica, starting from 2 minutes ago.
It's a very interesting tension between these 2 terms. We could say, for instance, the field of architecture, but we might also say the property of architecture, you know, sometimes.
I mean, field is a discipline as well, right? Of course.
Exactly.
But it's also a magnetic field. So it's
also
or geometric field. Okay, I propose that we start sharing the WhatsApp, and the rest of you that you didn't send already your pictures, you can slowly start uploading. So I'm sharing again my screen, and I invite Charlotte, Milica, Güler to comment on the drawings. Ah, okay, I see here is the magnetic field.
Yes. You wanted it, Metaxia, it's yours.
yes.
It's also rotated, so it's even more intriguing. Thanks.
Yeah, it's even upside down. Yes, I'm sure it was not conceptually intended. It was too fast to have an intention. Okay.
Okay, so field. Please jump in any moment.
Yeah. Just kind of getting a sense of what's being. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nice.
It's nice.
Somehow, Julia, every time that someone enters my WhatsApp, so
Okay.
maybe you need to accept them immediately.
Mhm.
It's interesting that a lot of the times field is also imagined in terms of property and boundaries,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So it's a kind of a conflated definition. I mean, I think normally when we speak about the field in the sense of discipline, we mean something with a really kind of let's say, a porous or open boundaries or boundaries that are really in a kind of organized as a kind of a gradient, you know, so that we cannot draw a line. There is a happy guy who is the owner of some kind of little things, little toys.
Yeah, I mean, I also see a lot of kind of overlaps between property and field. In fact, you could probably sometimes interchange them in the way that they've been drawn. I think it's also interesting to see how there is the kind of the fence seems to be a kind of recurring part of this conversation on both on field and on property. So it entails the kind of you know, limits. I think both.
I mean, it's you know, it's about a certain kind of imagination, about kind of imagining openness, right? So, you know, beyond the boundaries. And look, there's a coat or a jumper as a form of property.
So not only
is this
the
a
land.
kind of argument for minimal amount of personal possessions? All I need is a jumper or something. I'm curious. Field, well, chessboard, yeah. I think this is interesting somehow, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. The monopoly kind of. Yeah. There was also
what is this? It's a screen.
Jean-Marc. Yeah, he's his own
His
property.
name.
Property of the name, yeah.
He is the owner, or he's his own corporation. That's good.
There was also a quote from Marx earlier.
Yes.
Maybe I could go back at the end. Oh, very nice.
Great. Thank you for this. It's on the Honkeberg, isn't it?
It's, yeah.
Great.
Excellent.
Nice. So in relation to the previous, look, property, the same as field.
Yes.
It's fantastic. It's interesting also how these patterns of agriculture, of this kind of functionalist, geometric kind of approach to agriculture that surrounds us, let's say, is really dominating the imagination, you know, of what field can be or what land can be.
Well, I mean, I think we all carry a certain imaginary, you know, as a. I mean, it's also cultural, I guess, the kind of ways that we understand certain things to be. I mean, property fields are, I mean, not so often squares, right? In fact, very few. I mean, I will show examples that are in fact very square, but it's not, the majorities are not square, no? They are kind of, especially in places where you have kind of, let's say, inheritance.
This is interesting. This is about exploring the problem of verticality in property, like how much
here too,
above and below ground does the property extend? Ah, this is a kind of a nice design, beginning of a nice garden design.
Fences, a lot of fences.
It's strange that the fences are also in the field.
Yeah, that's
not
I mean, the kind of the two words have a tension, but they also have like many ways to see as an overlap, of course.
Of course, it's in relation to, I mean, maybe one of the things that didn't come up is, you know, in relation to field, as we said, if field is a discipline, then property would have the kind of intellectual property, right? Intellectual property rights,
I find it
copyrights, or ownership of ideas, of research, and so on. This is where a different kind of
I find it quite surprising that the field or the property come always with a little house. So they're kind of imagined that the scale of the individual linked to the, I don't know, primary need for housing yourself.
Yeah, football field.
There are also a few property titles. Oh, that's nice. Cadastre plan. Very good. Yeah, the kind of attachment to some kind of bureaucracy, I think, is also interesting. You know, holding a property, like to the title, in fact. Huh?
Property title, yes.
Yeah.
Voila.
Property. Here is another kind of a minimalist concept.
In your heart.
Body, heart.
Mobile.
I think it's a good kind of a track philosophically to explore the kind of necessary minimum, and of course there is a long history of that in architecture. Field in terms of species, that was interesting, a kind of a
construction. So in general, field is unbuilt and property is built. If you could kind of extract some sort of patterns, no? And
field. Oh, there was a kind of a Mondrian, somebody, maybe a Dutch person.
This is very nice. Yeah.
Maybe.
Wow, I think we saw them all this time. Great. Okay, then I can stop sharing.
Great. So thank you. Thank you for those contributions, for the relaxing start. And now for maybe if there is anyone among you who actually doesn't know Charlotte, we have prepared an introduction.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, probably, I hope, yeah. Okay, don't raise your hand if you don't know Charlotte. That's better to keep that quiet. But here, this is especially for you.
Yeah, for those who don't know Charlotte, I will just give an overview. So from my side, I would also welcome you once again to our 8th session of lecture series. I hereby would like to welcome and thank Charlotte to have accepted our invitation to deliver the lecture entitled Arable Land, Lost Lands. Charlotte is a dear colleague of ours and a former collaborator of the Chair of Architecture of Territory. And as you already know, she has helped us in conceiving the sessions of this lecture series around the theme of Earth. And since September this year, Charlotte holds the position of Assistant Professor of Urban Design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She is an architect and scholar who was involved in research and teaching for a very long time here in ETH. So that's why you might already know her from different instances. And she you might also know that she was the director of for several years for different cycles of the Master of Advanced Studies in Urban Design at the Chair of Marc Angélil. And in 2018, actually, she obtained her PhD degree from ETH on food territories, or more specifically on the effects of the political economy of food on the built environment, with Egypt as case study, from which we will also get a lot of information today. She is the author of very interesting books. Recently, she has published the Migrant Marseille, Architectures of Social Segregation and Urban Inclusivity, and co-authored Eileen Gray, A House Under the Sun, Some Haunted Spaces, Singapore, and Housing Cairo, The Informal Response. And said this, I would give the floor to Charlotte to give her great lecture, which we are looking forward to listen to it.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's always a pleasure to contribute to the conversation at the chair. So let me start and share. So you should see a white screen with the email address on the bottom. Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of choice of these words, in a way, they also speak about a kind of an entry point in this topic of land and of food production and property, or land tenure, as it's called, which is the topic of my talk today. As Güler mentioned, this is basically drawing from my doctoral work and the research I've been doing in Egypt in the past 5 to 6 years. And I think that if it may appear at first to be a very, let's say, highly contextual and very specific to the case of Egypt, I think that nevertheless there are many ways that you can also see this kind of approach as something that echoes with the way that let's say arable lands and food production and urbanization is being approached in other societies and closer to home. So I think, and this would be also interesting maybe to discuss after I've finished my talk, and maybe you can also see how it echoes into your own environment. So land is a finite resource, and agrarian land even more so. There is a certain amount of land available in the world to feed us, and there is some, I think, 48 million square kilometers. Various forces prey upon fertile land, and there are several reasons why agrarian land is lost, such as desertification, degradation, infrastructure, and also increased feed and fiber and fuel production, and urbanization. To illuminate this relationship between land tenure, agriculture, and urbanization, Egypt is a useful case study. In Egypt, agricultural land is a scarce resource. There is only 3.2 million hectares available for food production. What you see on this map, the kind of gray area around the Nile Valley. If you compare with a country which has about the same population, Germany cultivates some 18 million hectares. So as I said, most of these fields are located along the Nile Valley, which is home to some 80 million Egyptians. So the total area of arable land available is about 0.05 hectares per capita, which is the lowest ratio of agricultural land per person in Africa. So Egyptian agriculture on old lands, what you see on the upper side of this GIF here, is highly productive. You can have harvest 2 to 3 times a year. And the ownership of this agrarian land and the control over farming workforces is the objective of political struggles throughout centuries, as well as in the past decade. So in fact, the attempts of the state and its rulers to control land resource via agricultural production and ownership has been constant throughout Egyptian history via state intervention, colonial agrarian policies, and recent land reforms. And this narrative also explains the intense desire of Egyptian politicians since at least the 1950s to launch massive land reclamation, as it's called, to cultivate surfaces on desert land, what you see basically here. So you have this kind of dichotomy between the old lands and the new lands. And these new lands, in fact, they have very brutal adverse effects on water resources, on biodiversity and sustainability in general. The water is usually sourced from the aquifer or from the Nile. So you have the kind of a water resource issue here. And in fact, they have proven rather unsuccessful because the decrease of arable land has been steady since then. So new lands are never as fertile as old lands. For Egypt, and I mentioned water already, the Nile waters are basically essential to agriculture, and its management is imperative to ensure local food production. What you have here is the Nilometer. It's a kind of, let's say, an architecture or let's say almost a political economy made architecture, because you have, what you see here is a fine balance between appropriate irrigation and flood. So the water would come in as the flood of the Nile are arriving, going into this in this kind of structure, and we'll tell you, and here I don't know if you can read it, but it says hunger, suffering, happiness, and then it moves up to abundance, and then it turns to disaster. So there's a very thin moment where, you know, this kind of matter of life and death, the security of water flows down the Nile is basically directly related to population's food security, something that I think this wonderful architectural piece is indicative. So before 1801, as it is documented here in this French colonial report, La Description de l'Égypte, which you see here, flood waters were channeled into reservoirs or irrigation channels along the field, and they were pumped by animal, human, and hydraulic forces, distributed then in a kind of complex hierarchy, to be then released back to the river in a kind of complex and intricate mechanism called basin irrigation that you see here, which allowed for one crop harvest a year. Under Ali Pasha, the modern ruler of Egypt, agriculture then shifted from this basin irrigation to a perennial irrigation system in which the water is controlled via infrastructure so that it can be released throughout the year. During this period, we're talking so from the, let's say, feudal 19th century, around 1850, until the end of the British occupation, with this upgrading of irrigation system, you see a disciplining of farming populations with the emergence of large agricultural estates. And with the creation of these large estates, you also see coercive farming, so basically forced labor flourishing, with the farmers forced to work and stay on big estates. And landowners also start to construct this kind of organized village that you have here on the slide, where basically the owner imposed on his tenants a plan where everything has its logical place, and also basically to prevent the laborers from leaving the land back to their home village. The British, around the same time, launched the cadastral survey of Egypt, which is about recording every plot, the name of the owner, and to register this in maps. This is, of course, for tax reason. So while the calculation of land areas and tax liabilities in the Nile is perhaps the oldest continuous form of bureaucracy in the world, mapping property by British colonial forces was announcing what Timothy Mitchell calls new practices of calculation. And of course, this is in relation to, let's say, the disciplining of population as well as the land. It was produced using triangulation methods. Register for each village in the country listed the land of the village by field and plot, and for each plot up to 25 items of information, including the area, the class of the land, the text, and the owner and the occupier. And here you see the kind of triangulation method. The spatial presentation of land ownership made it impossible to record the same plot of land twice under different owners, and the map made immediately visible any plot of cultivated land that had not been registered under the owner and was thus evading taxation. So additionally, as most of the large estates emerged from this kind of top-down forces, let's say rulers or colonial powers, the mapping process was regulating abnormalities, and it also erased the signs of violence that could still be traced, these kind of large estates that I mentioned earlier. Quoting Mitchell again, the arbitrariness of large land ownership was merged into a uniform national space and made invisible. So in a way, you have a kind of overlaying or overlapping layers of property traces that do not necessarily trace this violence that Mitchell is talking about. The Cadastral Survey of Egypt also canceled knowledge of the village surveyors, so local inhabitants who were able to mark out the plot boundaries after the flood. So the flood would come and would basically, erase all traces of the land, property line, and then the villagers would come after the flood and would be able to relocate where were the property lines, and this was canceled after the dam, after the cadastral survey came, because they were then the reference, and then also afterwards this corresponding to the building of the first Aswan Dam, which basically regulated and kept the floods from coming. That's the first Aswan Dam, so it's not the modern one, it's the first one, which was located around 1,000 kilometers south of Cairo. It's an interesting piece of colonial infrastructure because it was financed by the Egyptian budget under British supervision, built by British contractors with Egyptian labor force. So you see the kind of financial construction of that. So the dam was to reorganize the distribution of expertise, taking away most of the local knowledge of flood basin irrigation distributed along the river and concentrating technical control at one site. So as I mentioned, the annual work of local surveyors was taken away. So the cadastral recording of the land in perspective with this infrastructural chronicle of the river materialized the will of controlling the land. Sorry, I was mentioning earlier how this kind of desire to control corresponds to also infrastructure. So here you have the first, let's say, wave or cycle of infrastructure by Ali Pasha, and then colonial powers with the low Aswan Dam and 3 other barrages, and then the ones that would be built by modern rulers like the High Aswan Dam and Lake Nasser, towards the kind of increasingly technocratic approach. So one can agree that the political history of Egypt as a nation state is linked to the irrigation of its soil, and the control of the river, and also the disciplining of the land and of the land ownership patterns. It's after the 1952 revolution when the royal forces were basically evicted and the British kicked out, that Gamal Nasser, which was a kind of socialist ruler, he comes in with this series of land reforms. So the reassigning of property in a way was something that improved the life of farmers and the living conditions. So I will tell you more about it. Here what you see is a fallah, a farmer who's holding Gamal Abdel Nasser's neck in gratitude, and he's kissing his forehead. And what you see in the background is a large crowd of farmers in traditional outfits that are cheering in the background. And all you see of the president is his back. But what you see is that he's holding a piece of paper in his hand, the famous property title that many of you were sketching earlier. And similar scenes were common throughout the 1950s, and they were all very well documented by press photography. You always see the president officially handing tenure documents to male and female peasants as formal land redistribution ceremonies. And these protocols somehow signal the reallocation of agrarian land as a political issue of great importance for the new regime. So what the system actually did was it's restricting land ownership and its size. So for instance, it was starting with capping big ownership of around 80 hectares, which is something very big. It corresponds to 200 fedans. I will talk about the fedans later. by individuals. So the excess land was then seized by the state and redistributed to landless peasants in very small plots of 1 to 2 to maximum 4 hectares. And then there were long-term public bonds that were used to compensate the owners at quite a low price, in fact. And then the land rents were also controlled. You could not, define the rent. This was kind of capped. It was a maximum of 7 times the basic land tax coming from the cadastre plan, the definition of the basic land tax, the assessed value of the land, which actually remained untouched until 1976. Which in fact corresponds to a rent freeze. So tenants were registered as the holders of the land and could not be evicted. Now, in 1962, almost a decade after this first land reform, the ceiling of ownership was reduced down to 40 hectares. So the state secured more land with also further measures. For instance, foreign owners were expropriated and prohibited to own agrarian land. And finally, a year before Nasser's death in 1969, the maximum land holding amount was reduced again down to 20 hectares. And with this change, the land redistribution process came to an end. There were about 3,000 square kilometers that has been redistributed to some 300,000 families. We're talking only about 13% of this arable land, which was distributed to 10% of the population. And some scholars have argued that this kind of top-down, state-inspired and state-led reforms was all about undermining upper classes while favoring rural middle class. So it's also about a kind of disempowering of the classes that are holding land, which were actually political rivals of the regime. But perhaps the most relevant and positive consequence of the reform should be measured in the larger context of Egypt. So basically big estates that were inherited from this feudal system were eliminated. This kind of like almost slave-like ownership was eliminated. So you could even call it a sort of decolonization of sorts. You also had cooperatives that were created that were guaranteeing equal access to agricultural inputs, so seeds and fertilizer at fixed price for all farmers, and also land lease conditions and preemption rights protected tenants, what I mentioned with this kind of land rent freeze, so an owner could not evict a tenant. So all of these measures resulted, let's say, in a betterment of rural income and food production. And additionally also brought order to cultivated land with this kind of rent and tenancy rights becoming regulated. Moreover, you could say that there are layers of economic development and social change that were addressed, which resulted in a paradigmatic shift in the way that the modest populations were perceiving the state. They perceived it as socially just. And as a testimony to success, you have images of Nasser still plastered in the walls of farmers' homes across the country. He remains a revered icon in Egypt's countryside till today. All these changes were basically reversed when, or attempted to be reversed when Western-oriented Anwar Sadat came into power in 1980 with the open door policy, which is basically corresponding with the liberalization years, seeing also the implementation of aggressive neoliberal policies. There are no images of Anwar Sadat being kissed by grateful fellas, and that is because Sadat established himself against Nasser's policy. Basically, he brought about changes in economics and ideologies. He rolled back Nasser's socialist legacy and strengthened large landowners. He announced basically a complete break from what could be called state capitalism, Nasserism, and farmers were summoned to make improvements. Agriculture is also in need of a strong drive so as to keep pace with the thought rates of development, he says in 1974. The same year, there's a law passed that abolished the state's role of custodianship of land, which means some 147,000 fields were confiscated and returned to the landowners that were dispossessed prior to Nasser. And in 1978, Sadat announced the start of Egypt's Green Revolution, which focus on developing new agricultural land in a way, what I showed earlier, this kind of new lands. This is to be also found at that moment in policy with this idea of improving, of making new lands instead of improving existing fertile areas. So for peasants and farmers, the Sadat years marked the dismantling of Nasser's strategy of redistributive justice, and the period inaugurates a long era of neglect concerning existing agricultural areas. His successor, Hosni Mubarak, saw the market-led agrarian reform, technicist agricultural policies favoring large-scale agribusinesses, and again, the land dispossession of smallholders and tenant farmers. From 1986 onwards, you see liberalization of markets, agricultural strategies aimed at the production of high-value crops for exports, implemented, encouraged by USAID and the World Bank. The idea is that agriculture should produce crops, cash crops, that would be sold abroad. In 91, Egypt agrees to an IMF reform, ERSAP, economic reform and structural adjustment program, a set of aggressive economic reform, public enterprise reform, market and trade liberalization, and private sector enhancements. Over this wave of changes, the biggest impact on land tenure was a law passed in 1992, which basically overturned Nasser's rent control guarantees for tenants. What I mentioned earlier is this kind of rent freeze. The law was voted following intense lobbying by landowners who were all members of the Mubarak government. The law stipulates the following: determining the rent has become freely done by both landlord and tenant according to the principle of the law of the contractors, with the consequent result of freedom of the two parties to formulate the provisions of the contract. So it's kind of saying that you can decide among one another, but obviously this is not an equal relationship. It is accompanied by a kind of a discourse also that accused the 1 million tenants of the country, which had no political representative in parliament, to be depicted in the media as lazy peasants abandoning the land. And this constructed image and misrepresentation contributed to justifying the return of the land to these famous destitute owners that had lost land under Nasser. So the law was implemented in 1997, and which resulted in sometimes the rent of the land to be increased 20 times the amount overnight, which caused massive eviction of tenants which were unable to pay. And then what it meant was that the tenancy became annual contracts to be renewed every year at the discretion of the landowners, and tenants sometimes who were farming the same plot since 40 years were evicted. And this means 1 million farmers lost their land, mostly small landowners, that year. So the effects on tenants' livelihoods were dramatic. Landless peasants unable to afford a field to sustain their family had to sell other assets. Children, mostly girls, were taken out of schools, and child labor in large farms, which had been reduced during the Nasser years, reappeared. Subsistence farming activities increased, with farmers concentrating on food production for survival instead of these famous cash crops. And then there's also an increase in immigration to Arab countries and Europe. Violence against the state surged with riots in several locations. And in the long term, years of neglect led to also a constant flow of rural migration to cities, something that might be also temporarily. There is also kind of pendular migration from cities and countryside, and also the increased pressure on affordable urban housing demand, a phenomenon that the state has failed to respond to and that I will talk about a little bit more later. So in January 2011, Tahrir Square was occupied for 18 days before the Mubarak regime fell. And if the setting and the population involved were overwhelmingly, let's say, urban, you can see also the countryside represented on the square. The demise of Mubarak was symbolically charged, prompting political action also in the countryside. Across the country, you can see collective grassroots movements towards reclaiming land tenure and property, and farmers organized themselves in order to reclaim plots from large landowners who had evicted them. And independent, unrecognized unions flourished, objecting to corrupted state officials and the violent takeovers of small farmers' land by agricultural business. So direct action was in fact taken to redistribute plots and contest irrigation access and land boundaries. When Mohamed Morsi came to power, farmers were also expecting some kind of institutional changes from the government with reservation. Farmer population hoped for a reversal of Mubarak's policy, even though they were distrustful of the Muslim Brotherhood, who had previously sided, in fact, with landowners. But in fact, when Morsi came to power, changes in tenure laws did not happen. On the contrary, when Small Farmers Union proposed that the Morsi government should cancel the law passed before, Mahmoud Jawda, which was the spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood Party at the time, refused to amend the law and said it is unacceptable intellectually or legally for the tenants to share ownership of the land with the owner. So the liberalization of the land market and erosion of rights suffered by the farmers of Egypt were not overturned during the revolution, nor with Morsi's short-lived presidency, leaving people with this impression. The revolution was good, but the dream of freedom, social justice, and human dignity has not been fulfilled. Under the presidency of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the last and current period is marked by the reassertion of military power over internal affairs, the enduring capitalization of large-scale agriculture, the neglect of farming population, and the acceleration of farmland loss to urbanization. Egypt's small farmers left in the dust by Sisi's agricultural project reads a headline of the Middle Eastern newspaper Al Monitor, referring to a project by Al-Sisi called 1.5 million Fedan project, so 1.5 fields project, a major land reclamation scheme for the new Valley Governorate, so the areas in the desert, launched in December 2015. And some of the major elements of the current governmental attitude towards land tenure and farming population are encapsulated in this apparently innocent article. In fact, military forces and private land ownership firms are the first beneficiaries of this public rural investment, rather than farmers of the Nile Delta and of the valley. The so-called old lands are totally absent from these projects. The prevalence of the military over land allocation processes is the central feature of the current regime and is exerted over the essential sectors of the national economy, as you see in this kind of diagram that's showing how across the 1940s to today, the investments of, let's say, in the military has been shifting from manufacturing towards all the other sectors, and that also includes agriculture in the new land. So it's all about, let's say, spending public money into making lands, let's say, fertile or attempting to be fertile. And that is something that actually that somehow exemplified, let's say, by this spatial conflict between cities and agrarian land. And some experts have said that Egypt loses some 11,000 hectares of agriculture every year. This is about 1% a year. Now I want to actually look a little bit into what it means for farmers. I looked at farmers' practices. So this is a part of the research that is corresponding to field work conducted on agrarian land, and also looking at how the relation between architecture and urban space and former agrarian land is also something that I would like to talk about. I have 3 cases of farming practices that I will discuss with you today. The cases are located at the periphery of, let's say, formal Cairo. They are on this. I don't know if you see my mouse, but they are in Ardileva, which is here, and in Mahmoudiya, which is at the border of, let's say, the city, as a kind of like peripheral conditions. The first case study is of a farmer that rents his land from Studio Masr, which is a movie company, who does not want to sell the land for construction so far. He's been farming this land for about 15 hectares, 3.8 hectares, around over 15 years, and he lives a little bit further away. So these 3.8 hectares that you see here are basically in 2003 in an area that's not so constructed. You see a little bit of construction on the left side, north of the field. You also see water canals here that are clean and accessible. And that is the situation 20 years later. The plot is almost entirely surrounded by construction. This is actually the area, how it looks like. You see these constructions in the back. They have some sort of formal registration, but they are illegal because in Egypt it is forbidden to build on agrarian land. It is practically impossible to get a permit. So all this kind of change of status of the land is strictly illegal. It's not allowed to build on fields. And what you see here is, and I will talk about it a little bit later, one-off towers. So they're built at once, almost over like a period of a very short time, like I think it's about 1 month per floor, very quickly, by semi-legal construction companies for speculative purposes. And that is something you can actually detect on this construction, because you see that when people move in, they install windows, and after the 6th or the 7th floor, there is nobody. This is because people don't trust elevators. So they will not buy anything in which they will actually move into. So everything that is bought upstairs is actually empty and remains empty. It's like a form of, let's say, savings. But I will talk about this a little bit later. So one of the consequences of this urbanization is related to water supply. There is less water, it's polluted, the canal water does not flow, it's clogged with rubbish and construction rubble. This farmer here organized a pump for accessing groundwater, but he anyway had to switch from cultivating wheat and vegetables for human consumption to mainly clover and alfalfa for animals. He keeps about 20 cows. And he sells the clover and the alfalfa here on the right side to people who keep animals in the city. So also a form of urban farming that I will also mention later again. Socially, most of the farming population that was cultivating the land that is now constructed stopped farming and looked for other forms of employment. And a few others went to farm on these famous desert reclaimed lands in the desert. The second farmer that you see here actually owns the land, so he's a landowner. He lives on the farm, on the site, on about 2.4 hectares. He inherited the land and he had to give some of his land during the Nasser reforms. He now has 2.4 hectares. At this place, he also has other land in outside of the city, or further away. So what you see here in 2003 is an area that is almost entirely, let's say, unconstructed, with a very few construction, again, north of the plot. And the area today here, again, is very much surrounded by construction. He himself recognized that urbanization started around 1970. That is when he kind of dates it. And he said it increased severely in the years following the 2011 revolution, something that also has to do with the kind of vacuum of power that was the case at the time. The consequences are the same redundant problem of water, which is polluted, less quality. He said that there used to be fishes in this canal, which is not the case anymore. And he also mentioned that one of the indirect impact of urbanization is that the channels were starting to smell. So farmers cut the trees that were along the fields to allow for better wind and airflows, which were lessened by the neighboring buildings. So you have also kind of construction of air in this case. So he used to cultivate eggplants, tomatoes, but he complains about the presence of humans and also of animals. He refers specifically to cats and dogs as being a problem, and then switched to corn and clover, and he still harvests the date trees that you see here on the right side. So as mentioned, he also has other fields outside of the city where he grows wheat for self-consumption and selling, but not here, not on these fields. He also mentioned, so a very kind of let's say, eye-opening point, because when we were there, we were a little bit nostalgic and saying, you know, how do you see this urbanization? And he said that, well, when the time will come, he will also build a house there for his family, but tries to keep the land as much as possible for farming. But, you know, if it makes sense and he has to sell, he will. Then the last case study, this farmer that you see actually on the right side of the image, on the left side, it's a local inhabitants of the area who does not farm. So the person on the right side is renting a very small land piece of 0.2 hectares, surrounded at the moment already by very high buildings here on the right side. His plot is about half a hectare. As I said, it's here marked on that area here. So it's very much closer to central Cairo. As you see, it's an area that in 2003 is already, semi-developed, and today it's basically almost entirely consolidated in terms of urban growth. He's, I mean, just to go back, he actually only grows clover. He also complained very much about shade and trash. He has a pump. That is the only reason he's able to farm, is because he has a pump and a well that gives him access to the water, and also the fact that the landowner does not seem to be interested in selling this plot, so he can keep on farming it. He's been farming it since almost 40 years, and he said that his children are not interested in farming the land. So on the long run, he won't be doing that. So at a larger scale, and here the area, the same area that I just mentioned, here you see the plot before, it speaks of a kind of a magnitude of the disappearance of this farmland at the immediate periphery of Cairo. And what you see here is the ring road, which is here you see it partially in the kind of scheme here, was drawn on the 1983 master plan, which was developed by French planner. It's basically mimicking the Paris périphérique, and it's intending, since the problem of encroachment on agrarian land was identified already in the 1980s, it's intended to protect farmland. So by first establishing what you see on the right side, settlements on desert land, again with this idea of occupying the desert and encouraging urban development on the east and on the west of the city, and also to incorporate this kind of ring road to constrict the growth. So the idea is that you would have something that is perhaps deep and not allowing for construction, but in fact it had total opposite effect, because, and let me go back here to show that, the connection between, so the idea was to constrict basically the growth to the inwards of the city, but of course this is basically connecting also the outside, and this is exactly what happened with making these areas easy and to access, and making them basically prone to development. So considering the absence of any form of control, as I mentioned, it's almost impossible to legalize construction, which means that the construction is happening illegally and it's not being sanctioned. What you see here is this kind of incremental and self-built construction at first, which was the origin of how this urbanization took place, talking about small-scale informal housing construction, to what I mentioned earlier as this semi-professional speculative urban scheme had a major impact on the space with which agricultural land around Cairo is disappearing. So what you see here, as I mentioned, is the area of Ardilewa, which is entirely constructed on agrarian land. And I want to talk a little bit about the urban form and the relationship to land property. I just want to give you a small hint on the datation possibilities of this construction. As you see, the buildings are not plastered. So you have exposed red bricks, and you can see how let's say the dust that is covering the building tells you when you have fresh construction. So here you can see red brick, here red brick, and here this kind of big towers also in red brick, and this kind of extension here also tells you what has been built at which pace in comparison to the dusty parts, which are basically ancient. So and here you start to see that you have a kind of very regular frame and also a kind of longitudinal streetscape, and I want to discuss this in relation to the cadastre plan that you see here around 1950. I mentioned these fedans. Basically, those are fedan. It's very longitudinal fields, about 200 meters by 17, and that is for irrigation purposes. What you see here are basically irrigation channels, and that is a cadastre plan pre-1950 of these neighborhoods. And you have here a kind of village structure and the city is appearing here on the right side. So that is the area redrawn in 1960. And here you can see some kind of urbanization creeping in at the limits of the city. This is the area of Mohandesin, which is a planned neighborhood built in the 1960s. And there's a train track here. And that is the area today. So how did that happen? That's the process of growth. I was mentioning this kind of fedan. Here you see a kind of piece. It's a longitudinal field. It's already subdivided because of agrarian practices in what you call kirat, which are these kind of very small squares of 12 by 14 meters where you would plant something else, or you would even borrow it to a neighbor. And this is what is being sold and built over. That is the first kind of pieces of land that you see is being built over. The canals that are here are then filled to create a kind of access road for construction. These buildings then multiply and they start to affect the agrarian practices. As I mentioned, trash and shade. The land price also go up and the agriculture becomes, let's say, less profitable because of these conditions. Tenants are evicted. If the owner sees that the land price is rising, he can or she can evict his tenants because of this canceling of rent protections that I mentioned earlier. And finally, the entire fedan is constructed and the area urbanized. The canals become streets. And then you see, as I mentioned, the kind of condition of any kind of surviving practice is basically suffering from this trash condition. The groundwater is polluted because there is also issues of sewage from the housing, and it's not possible to grow food consumption, let's say harvest on this. And only clover, which you see on the left image, is a viable option. This is the typical architecture that is produced by these protocols. It's blind on 3 facades because the neighbor will come right, left, and behind to build. The occupancy of the plot is almost complete, except for 2.5 meters that you leave to the street, to the former canal. The structure is usually concrete and brick infill. And then you have a kind of organization with a central staircase with ventilation shafts, sometimes 1, sometimes 2 or 3. It's important to signal that this unit or this type of architecture is not to be understood as a single architectural entity, but it is the very fabric of the city because it's an endlessly repeated type. And there are a few plans that circulate and they get repeated. And this repetition along the field that I mentioned earlier is generating this kind of longitudinal streetscape, a sort of urban canyon of type. So I mentioned earlier the kind of small construction and the big construction. This construction is driven and organized by local actors who aim to produce standardized housing at reduced costs while generating a profit or building for themselves sometimes. They pool financial capital, they buy the land, they're also sourcing all the materials and the resources, they organize and supervise construction and connecting to infrastructure if possible. And after the revolution, I argue that there was a noticeable shift in housing typologies from the self-build, low-rise structure, incrementally built that you see on the left side, where basically people would build only an additional floor if they need it, if their children get married or something like that. On the right side, you have the semi-professional 15-story towers, which are basically bought as securities on the market within the framework of a gray economy, as I mentioned, with people not trusting elevators and only buying it to use it as savings. So let us look at 2 of these architectural typologies at opposite sides of the spectrum. I will talk about type 1 and type 5 very briefly. So type 1, as I said, is the classic scenario. It's built on 1 kirat, so it's about between 70 and 140 square meter plot. It's strictly residential. It's usually a family who's pooling resources using a collective system within an extended family. It's called a gamaya. It's a rotating system of sharing resources and pooling resources. The owner of the plot, so he will buy the plot to someone who had it previously as a farming or having a tenant on it and expelling the tenant. He will buy the construction material and supervise the construction himself or hire a small contractor for it. And then the family moves in before the building is completed, usually on the ground floor. So this one that you see here is built on 1 kirat of 10 by 9. It's a very small plot. There is 1 meter 10 given to the streets. It's blind on 3 facades, as I said, with a single staircase and 1 shaft. And he has a balcony on some of the floors. The construction is done according to financing. So maybe you have money to build 2 or 3 floors, but not more. In this case, the owner has 4 sons. So he built 1 floor per son, and the upper floor he will give to his daughter. He explains that, and he was insisting on the fact that he was a modern man because of that. This is the inside. Typical in this case is that, as I said, people live in unfinished buildings. So for instance, the owner was about to move into the ground floor that you see here, and he keeps goats on the upper floor before Eid celebration. These are surviving agrarian practices. This is the reality of urban farming in this area. So we are here faced with a, let's say, small scale, self-organized, let's say almost self-built housing typology with a single family ownership. The type 5 that I was mentioning earlier is the speculative scenario. It's a large building located on the main street. It's owned by a partnership of 4 members. They bought the land, which at the time of the purchase was in fact still planted, for about $200 per square meter. And the whole land costed about $100,000, a sum that they split equally among the 4 business partners. Then as you see, it's a merger of 4 kirats. So there would be 4 plots, 4 of these small plots for this kind of very big, let's say 400 square meter, in fact, plot. So it took something like 8 years to construct that. The partnership commissioned an engineer to assess the structure, a process that itself took something like a year. And then each of these floors, so what you see here is the residential floor, has 4 units of various sizes from 60 square meters to 120. You see here the entrance. So this is 1 unit, this is another unit, and here in the back, 2 units. And the stairwell at the core of the building includes a shaft for a lift that was not installed at the time. The 10-story building is composed of a double height ground floor, which is intended to host a mall or a kind of shopping center, plus 4 commercial floors with production, like workshops, and then 4 residential floor on the top. At the time, the building was not completed on the upper floor. You can buy an apartment there for about $20,000 between $18,000 and $20,000 for the largest flat on the main street. And each partner owns 1/4 of the mall, 1 commercial floor, and 1 residential floor each. So informal construction at this stage of development points at the manner in which capital and financial forces have penetrated into what was once a small-scale and self-built form of urban production, what emerged in the 1970s as a popular response to public incapacities to provide affordable housing solutions to lower classes in Egypt, has evolved into a classic market process, tending towards formal modes of real estate investment. In this process, agricultural land does not stand a chance against the 200% profit that can be generated by turning land into construction. And just maybe one small word about the paradoxical situation there is here. The people that are moving into these areas are sometimes former farmers themselves, and it's also resulting to the lack of affordability or even the lack of accessibility of housing in Egypt. So the kind of, let's say, competition between 2 of these basic needs that are food and shelter is somehow encapsulated in that particular condition. So the government's response in terms of dealing with this issue of agrarian land is geared towards, let's say, the reclamation of agriculture, of desert land. So there is some 600,000 hectares of land that is part of the project, ongoing project to reclaim on agrarian land. They call it, on desert land. So it's this kind of reclamation of desert land, sourcing water from underground aquifers. But as I said earlier, mostly reclaimed land is not as productive as farmland, and the program cannot compensate for the amount of agricultural land that is being lost. It's largely used as a political response to anxieties about urbanization and food insecurities, as well as siphoning public fund into private endeavors via this kind of, let's say, enterprises. So to conclude, neither legislation prohibited construction on agricultural land, which I mentioned earlier, the almost impossibility of basically constructing legally in a way that means it's not controlled, or any schemes to divert urbanization with the construction of new cities on the outside of the area, of the fertile areas, has been able to curb the loss of fertile land to urban development. And considering that post-revolution urban growth appears steady, that the benefits generated by informal construction make encroachment onto farmland almost irresistible, that most households do not have the means to opt for formal housing, and that public housing policies have not responded to low-income demand for housing, and that these districts on fertile areas are very well connected to major infrastructure and to job opportunities, and that food policies fuel rural to urban migration. I didn't mention it, but there is a whole discussion on food subsidies. And let's say also the fact that the government has abandoned the old lands also fuel this kind of rural to urban migration. It is likely that the encroachment on agrarian land at the immediate peri-urban area of Cairo will consolidate, eventually leading to a kind of disappearance of this agrarian land. And with this, I would like to let's say open the floor and ask if you have questions, and how to engage with that question, and maybe also think of some form of parallel. If you could turn on your cameras again, it would be wonderful to see a little bit of a human interaction, which I personally miss a lot. So yes, that's. And I also see some very familiar faces, which is very nice. They know who they are.
Fantastic. Shall we start immediately with the questions from the audience?
That would be great. I know you're not allowed to do cold calling, but I could. Do you use this term here also? Cold calling is like when you call someone who is there and be like, so what do you think? In GSD, it's a bit, it's like, it's not very nice. You should not do it, they said. So I prefer if there is a spontaneous question.
So perhaps I can ask you to what extent have you followed the recent developments in Egypt, or let's say the very recent? I mean, we've seen Sisi with Donald Trump. You spoke about military influences or the kind of militarization. Where do you see this going, right? So if I understood correctly, there is the military ownership and control over land is increasing. What kind of proportion are we talking about? So who are now the big players? So we have some land has returned to the former, let's say, pre-Nasser owners. Maybe there are even the kind of colonial figures are part of those. I mean, who are the big players, let's say, currently? I think that this process around Cairo is fueled by these, let's say, presence of these small plots, right? But I guess that in some other parts of the Nile Valley, this kind of expansion is impossible because we have some kind of larger kind of ownership consolidated. So how would you describe this wider field?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key aspects is that the governmental policies are basically focused on this kind of development on on desert land, and that has been ongoing. I think the latest development just is to push for the implementation of kind of maximizing agricultural industrialization, in fact, and also to push for this kind of agricultural exports and crops as a kind of cash return policy, which is something that has been implemented since almost the early 90s. This is very much ongoing. I didn't talk about it, but there are several large-scale infrastructure projects that are being currently implemented in the desert, so away from Cairo, very far, in fact, rather towards Lake Nasser, that are being pushed. So I would say that the current situation is very much ongoing, as in how the current government has been envisioning it. There is no shift in policies. The idea is to push for more industrial, large-scale agricultural production on desert land, and I would say that there is very little investment on the old lands. So the kind of traditional agriculture, let's say, in its format is not supported. There is also one important, very important reason for that, is that in Egypt, desert land belongs to the military by default. So it means that this is basically an untapped capital. And that is part of the, let's say, motivation behind pushing agricultural land to be developed on the desert, because it's a financial, how you say, golden chicken or whatever you call it. But
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so that is one of the let's say one of the many let's say incentives for building, but it's also part of a discourse on agro technology, right? Which is
of
grounded
course
in ideology. I mentioned the IMF and all these questions. So I think this is where I see
it's interesting. This kind of agro technofix is very somehow geographically, to say so, predetermined, and it appears indeed. I mean, we see it in the Arab world, in the Middle East, in conjunction with the climate, with the, the, let's say, geographic, to say so, reality of the desert, with the kind of politics of all that. So Israel, for instance, is very similar. Saudis, to say so, Arabia has a similar policy. So I think a range of countries. And
yeah, Saudi Arabia is also involved in this large-scale, like, let's say, agricultural scheme in Egypt. It has been involved in financing, this kind of central pivot irrigation. Maybe I can find an image that I think would be very telling of this kind of development while I'm speaking. But I think that there is also something very interesting and that I also, let's say, try to explain in my dissertation, which is the kind of resistance of this kind of old lands to the kind of more techno forms of agriculture, which are usually calling for very big, this kind of central pivot irrigation formats. They are not really working with this kind of very long, thin lines of irrigation patterns that I've shown. So I think that there's a facility. It's easier to implement this stuff in the desert because there's
exactly. I mean,
no impediment.
We have in these discussions around let's say extended urbanization, so-called, to use that term that was proposed by Christian Schmid. there is this a notion of operationalization of agriculture and agricultural land, right? And it's interesting that indeed the kind of one of the conclusions is that in the areas where something changed on my screen. This
yeah,
is
that's what I just want to show you here. These kind of patterns are actually sourcing from the aquifer, large scale, and it here also the kind of central pivot irrigation that is sourcing. This is sourced from Lake Nasser in this case, from the Sheikh Zayed Canal, but it's typical of this kind of I mean, just to put an image on what it means, this kind of agro technical developments on desert land, this is how it looks like. And this is also in terms of labor very much kind of also something highly technocratic, because for instance, you can, central pivot irrigation, they are basically relying on technology that is imported. So here you also have a kind of financial hegemony that is related to Western technologies, because if you want to implement this kind of technologies, central pivot irrigation is basically let's say satellite driven, for instance. It's a kind of you just need one person, you need one technician who would, once it's installed, control the machine, and it will kind of go on itself. This costs, this is costly infrastructure that is basically going to, I mean, for instance, the Dutch are very good with this kind of canal irrigation infrastructures. I mean, they have a history of pumping and so on and so forth, so they're very present. So yeah, just to say that these are mechanisms.
Of course, but it's interesting that this Dutch model has been based on, has also been kind of the so-called polder model, right? Is the origin of the Dutch democracy.
The very existence of the country.
Exactly, the very existence of the country.
Relying on pumps.
It has been, and I think Egypt, I mean, the Nile Valley has been, I would say, the history of a certain, I would say, kind of a, how would you call it, a kind of a communal politics has been, to say so, woven together with that water management of the old land, right? I mean, what has happened to Holland in more recent history, this is something we could discuss, right? But let's say the polder model has been the basis of a Dutch democracy, right? And the patterns, let's say, in the polderland. So I'm interested maybe to, if you speak of this resistance of old land, what precisely is that resistance today? Or, I mean, if you can tell us a little bit your thoughts on that, no?
I mean, I think there's in Egypt...
Because it has to do with property, and it has to do with to say so, forces on the old land that are resisting this kind of, to say so, unfolding or unrolling of this kind of technofix apparatus, military control, state control, etc., etc.
Yeah. No,
so what is this resistance?
I think that there is, I try to explain it a little bit, so I think that maybe comes across. There is this kind of history, or let's say there is a legacy of agrarian practices going hand in hand with this idea of redistribution of land and some kind of like social justice that is grounded in this kind of Nasserist policies. And that has somehow remained a very important feature of the kind of, let's say, political psyche in this kind of area. So in a way, the agrarian, we had a conversation last week about the kind of, political inclinations of farming populations. And I think that this is still a very interesting topic. In the case of Egypt, it's very clear that the kind of socialist Nasserist logic is very much still in place. There are these kind of, let's say, cooperatives, which were also, and not to be romantic about those, were also an instrument of the state to control these farming populations, of course, because you can give them which kind of seeds you give them, which kinds of fertilizer you give them, to who do you give and not give, you know, I mean, there's a whole pattern of control, of course, that is attached to these cooperatives. But still, it also has a kind of understanding of farming that is very solidary, I would say, where you would do that kind of farming together, or like kind of sharing and you know, negotiating land, water rights and things like that. And this is something that is also in the nature of the property plots, I think, and this kind of very small land ownership, completely opposed to this kind of top-down, you know, ways of farming that relies on kind of heavy machinery and this kind of thing. So I think that this resistance is on the one hand grounded into like a political history, and on the other on a kind of territorial reciprocity of the land to be kind of unable to, or let's say, in a way, well, I'm trying to find another word to resistance, but something that is like almost in the topography opposed to that kind of growth. In a way, it's something you could compare to even some Swiss areas that are very,
or let's say in the fabric of that territory with the small scale,
property
with the
patterns are basically, you know, if you wanted to do a pivot irrigation, you would need to buy, I don't know how many.
Yeah, of course, you have to buy out entire villages.
Or you have to discuss with everybody so that everybody agrees.
Yeah.
Forget it. Not happening. I mean,
of course, but what is very interesting also, let's say politically speaking, is that you are describing, it's almost, Egypt is such a good case because it's almost a caricature. So you have this kind of a desert as a playing field of these you know, of the military and the state and the big capital and the kind of a whole, to say so, a right-wing, let's say, apparatus. And then you have this kind of a sliver around the Nile, which is some kind of a core of, let's say, resistance with this kind of a more kind of a tied to some historic ideologies and socialist views and the kind of, you know, even the kind of a pre-modern and so on. And so what I would like to, I mean, I'm happy to open the floor, but I would really like to use the moment also to make a small bridge or a kind of an outlook toward, let's say, our own context and geographies, and to kind of just to kind of explore a little bit the implications of your talk for, to say so, our own environments closer to home, right? So let's say if we would like to project some of those messages toward our own situation, I mean, for instance, we are working now also in a studio that has to do with agricultural, you know, politics around Zurich, right? And are very much discussing about, you know, agrarian policies, you know, land consumption, you know, the role of subsidies, you know, many things resonate even on, for instance, the phenomenon of enlargement of property, right, is very much in the recent history around Zurich, right? So the number of farms is going down, the kind of, to say so, automatization, machinery, you know, dependence on technology. So we could, you know, if we are to say so, to resonate toward the case of Egypt, we could say it's very interesting how that as you said, de-peasantization is being carried out, but we also in a way understand that it has to do with a very particular set of I mean, that particular social politics is, to say so, tied into these processes, and also very particular ecological politics. So it's about intensification, it's about, you know, let's say at the same time, we see that there are, I would even around Zurich describe it as a kind of pockets of resistance or sites, you know, where people practice solidarity agriculture, where, you know, pioneers went to do permaculture, where, you know, some people want to do Demeter farms and organic, and, you know, their neighbors are. So in a way, the geography, let's say in Switzerland, is much more, everything is, to say so, mixed and next to each other, you know, whereas Egypt, you somehow describe it as a kind of a geographically, let's say, a more divided field, right? Or more clearly, to say so, organized. So, so I would ask you, how would you make that bridge toward the European context? I mean, for example, you have participated in the discussions, or in the property drama,
yes.
let's say, discussions with Arno. I mean, that was about the future, yes, of the food system. You know, that's very much coming close to home, let's say. So perhaps maybe that would be the way to begin to link these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several ways that you can see, and I think that this, I mean, I just want to, for instance, ground it into a kind of, let's say, personal histories. I think that many of us, if we just look a few generations back, we can see that, you know, our great-grandfather or great-grandparents were farming as an activity. So just to ground it in a kind of more global history of food production, and how the kind of shift that has happened in the past, you know, like, let's say, maybe 50 years is something that is actually quite recent. And I think it's a very interesting exercise to try to trace back that kind of presence of agricultural past in our own history as an identity that is also, you know, let's say, part of that common history. But this say, and to move away from the kind of more you know, personal view, I think that there is also, for me, very clearly, when I talk about this kind of ideology in terms of food production, I think that what you can see at work in Egypt, and this kind of privatization and liberalization and kind of a techno fix in terms of agricultural production, is something that is very much you know, taking place across the globe, I would say. I think that the kind of mass production in terms of agriculture is quite worrying, and it's something that has been really gaining traction. Of course, they are now, and I think that's very hopeful in the discourse on food production, also a shift. And you were mentioning this kind of pockets of resistance. I think some of you have been exposed to see, you know, how there are different ways of, you know, producing food, and how that can be promising for the future, I would say. And maybe to pick up on this question of the food production and let's say food system in the future, I indeed contributed a small piece into that Biennale exercise 2038 that is to be happening at the German pavilion in the Venice Biennale, if it happens. That is about the future of property. And there was something about that was worth exploring, which was a bit provocative, but was very much grounded not only in the Egyptian case, where you see that mechanisms of real estate are also, you know, kind of acting upon land because of the profit generating that it has, but this is something that you can also see in our I would say in our environments when there are I think in Switzerland it's now being quite regulated, but in other places it's not. I'm thinking about France, which loses agrarian land also every year. The question of allowing for land to be to be built over as a kind of, let's say, policy question almost, as something that could be, you know, changed. In the case of Egypt, it's definitely not about regulating more, because as I said, it's hyper regulated and no one respects those laws. So it's more about making sure that the that the farming populations are, you know, being taken care of and not abandoned. I think that this is really a clear case in the case of Egypt. And I think in other places it's not so easy. But then also the question of local food production is something that I thought was very promising and was also a bit brought about during the kind of, let's say, first lockdown in March, where, you know, the kind of conversation on where do you source your food from, now that you cannot really access, you know, like how do you make sure that the kind of local production is something that is finding its way into consumers' plates, as a kind of rising awareness of the potential that local food systems have. So the kind of immediate, a little bit this kind of cooperatives and everything. I think that there was a rising awareness during that time. I don't know if this is something that's ongoing, and I can also share with you that text that I wrote about that later on, or mail it. But I thought that those were a few directions that were interesting.
Yeah, that would be great if you want to share it with us, perhaps even with the whole auditorium. If you allow, we will gladly
find it. Yeah,
gladly share it. Yeah. So a couple of more minutes. Shall we open to the floor? Is that there's a question mark? Is that a raised hand, or is that's a question? I guess.
You can also type questions in the chat if you don't feel like showing your face or anything like that. I know this is not popular, but it's also okay.
I got a question about like in the example of Cairo. Quite a lot of it sounded to me like it's really self-organized, and they have kind of, you described the financial system and also how the floor plans develop and how the streets.
You're talking about urbanization, right? About the housing.
Yes, exactly. And it seems like quite a community effort also, although every single unit is then for an individual or a family. Is there a way to also deal with the problems they create with it, with the water pollution and stuff like that, community efforts to solve stuff like this, or does it like end there and then it's every single one's problem?
No, I think that's thank you for your question. Yeah, no, I think that's no, these communities are very strong. So for instance, there is a very fun example that I always tell whenever I can, because I think it's a wonderful example of this kind of self-empowerment. So if you remember, I mentioned that there was this kind of ring road that was passing by. Of course, this ring road doesn't care at all about the informal areas it's crossing. You know, there are no exits. There's not even like safety. It's actually very dangerous for this area, because it's kind of, you know, people cross, you know, like jaywalking is common. But this area that I was talking about earlier, where I did all the field work, and also where these kind of towers are located, during the revolution, so around 2011, when you had this kind of total vacuum of power, and, you know, there were no policemen nowhere, you know, like this kind of disappearance of the state. They basically rented a Caterpillar, and they made their own exit on the highway. They just, you know, kind of digged it, and then they asphalted it, and then they made a ribbon, and they invited the governor of the Giza governorate to open the ribbon, and they did, and then they were like, okay, now we have an exit. So they did that, which is a kind of, I think, very interesting kind of self-empowerment. Also, it's a very big scale, you know, endeavor. I think that there's always this conversation whether communities are able to provide for themselves, and there is a moment where you can just say that the state has to provide, you know, like hospitals, schools, big infrastructure are something that the state has to provide, and not informal communities. And that was an interesting let's say, scaling up of self or let's say community organization. But then it had like interesting side effects. So for instance, they had done this connection, which means the value of the land increased, of course, because then they had a kind of access. So this kind of that's one of the examples where you can see that there is a connection between a possible large infrastructure and community. Then there is a whole aspect which is related to the connection to water and electricity system. So for instance, usually what happens is that the community manages to pay for like digging their kind of trenches and to put pipes, and then usually what happens is that they bribe the kind of local agents that are in charge of the connection to the official system. So some of these areas are in fact connected to the usually to the sewage system and to the electricity system in any case, but people pay their own electricity bills. They're just not legally recognized as that, but they have like meters and they pay. And actually what happened is that very often, if you live in an informal area, you will pay always more. You're being cheated by the kind of, you're being cheated of access to public infrastructure because you have to pay for it yourself, you have to install it yourself, and ultimately you don't get the same service. So there is a kind of, that's why it's sometimes referred to as unjust urbanism because of that.
Okay, so actually we have
an exercise.
Due to the interesting discussion, we overstepped our time a little bit, sorry. And so apologies for that. So it's time for the exercise.
Yes. So
Charlotte will introduce today.
Let me go back to my exercise sheet. So where is it? Yes, here. So. Here. You see graded exercise?
We see it, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Great.
So I will read it, and I think that maybe there were a lot of hints at what you can actually look for this exercise. What could be also a fun way to I think, talk about agrarian practices or even agrarian patterns into our everyday. So I will just read it, and you can also follow. Using simple graphics as representation, up to you field ask you to produce a line drawing by hand, preferably with notations. The drawing shall represent our own perspective on our immediate environment or a selected site of architectural interest in or around Zurich. So it can be something that is around your own immediate, in fact, living quarters, but you can also select another site, the Blattspitz in Zurich or Sexy Leutenplatz or whatever you feel could be interesting. And then this kind of, I will give a few references afterwards. So the exercise asks for us to detect and draw if and how rurality, and by that I mean agricultural practices and forms, so surviving forms, possibility of looking at property patterns, for instance, productive practices, whatever form of fertile soil you can still identify or see surviving patterns of property limits. And here I would also like to add, even I think to a certain extent, the kind of circulation patterns could be also something interesting as grounded into previous, let's say, circulation or irrigation formats, and how that is present in our everyday, what you see from your window or local site of choice. Second, so this can be something that is on top of or just that, so it's either or and, which non-humans, living organisms surrounds us, which form do they take? So earth, dirt, vegetation, animals, invisibles. This is more in relation to everything that is not us, as in not built, and possibly this kind of surviving patterns of soil also as something that could be identified, and how do we interact with those. And then optional, if you want to integrate a kind of projective element in the drawing, it can just be a sentence of what Milica was talking about, a kind of future vision or something that could be a kind of direction to ponder upon. in terms of all these topics that we talked today, showing how the ecology between human and non-human could be fostered within a spatial context. It's one A3 hand drawing with annotations. And here I'm showing you this reference from Jan Rothuizen. I probably not pronounce it. These Dutch names are very hard. Rothuizen. Milica, you have better
Rothhausen.
Okay.
I'm also not Dutch, but
I know, but you have more
that's
practice.
what they told me over there. I'm trying to.
So as you see, this is kind of more like a bird eye view, and it doesn't have any patterns of property, but I think this could be superimposed over that. This is just a more in-house, let's say, interior view. I think it could be also interesting, but perhaps towards outside. So I don't know, that will maybe just a different scale to show how this could work. And here I just want to show a few examples that I identified from a work on survivance of agrarian practices into urbanization that is on the city of Riom in France, in Auvergne. And this is like also to say that it might be interesting to source for that particular view. It could be interesting to do a little bit of research on how a certain city is grounded into former patterns. So this is like a 1700 drawing that shows very, very well this kind of division between agrarian practices and the city, and potentially also cadastres as a kind of a way of identifying this some of the patterns. And here I was talking about the circulation as well. So here you see this is the same city. This is the Napoleonian cadastre that has identified property lines. So you see this kind of discussion on cadastre and property has been grounded in the kind of ordering of the land, and also has survived into certain ways that urbanization happened. So here you can very clearly see the kind of street still, and even this kind of patterns are somehow here still visible in the kind of satellite image of 2013. It's also maybe interesting to look at this kind of imagery or iconographies of the past centuries. This is not necessarily showing a kind of agricultural surviving patterns, but you can still see how the site has changed. You can see here a kind of let's say small garden as a kind of element. And I just suggest for those of you who are interested, and if you're also looking at exterior areas, the State Archive of the Canton has a lot of old maps that could be very useful. And there is also the kind of overlapping, I think it's from the city of Zurich archival map, where you can identify some patterns that could be interesting to pursue. So yeah, are there questions maybe, and Milica, you can of course or Güler and Metaxia kind of expand this. I mean, this is a bit of an experiment, I guess. I just thought it would be interesting to also apply this kind of conversation on how they are this kind of surviving patterns, or even some kinds of activities perhaps. And here we can even talk about some way of urban farming, if there is anything that can be identified as potentially interesting. I know that the Blättspitz, for instance, used to be Schrebergarten, the area in front of the Landesmuseum. So I don't know if there is anything left.
It's about perhaps reconstructing some of the historic patterns
also
of,
yes,
let's say, farming within perhaps the city of Zurich, the kind of recent memories, but also perhaps the kind of possibilities, because let's say if there is a lot of imagery and iconography and even a kind of promotional materials around Plan Wahlen.
Yes.
No, that's the moment of exploring self-sufficiency in Switzerland, also in a kind of a top-down manner during the second and after the Second World War. And interestingly, there is this big field here more or less next to Ona. You are probably passing along it, that is named after Mr. Wahlen. I think his name is Frederick or Ferdinand or something like that. So let's say this big field of grass we have never found out, but I guess that whoever named this field after Wahlen was suggesting a kind of a, let's say, scenario of urban
youth,
agriculture.
turning it into a potato field.
Right. So let's say the kind of interest here is to either, to say so, go through a kind of a historical exploration or through a kind of projective to imagine whether and how let's say food production, if I understand correctly, could be maybe mixed or be more present in our daily lives. Does that
yeah, I think that would be one of the possible directions. I think there are many ways to explore this this kind of format, so I'm curious.
Great. You will take part in the grading.
I hope so. Yes, that would be great.
Any questions on
there are
exercise?
2 questions in actually in the chat, so if you'd like to go through them, Charlotte.
Wait, then I need to stop sharing, otherwise I cannot see it. Sorry. Felipe is here. Oh, that's so nice. Hi, Felipe. Percentage of water destined to existing urbanization. Okay, I don't have the numbers regarding the water consumption, but I know that there is conversation ongoing on. I mean, for the longest time there was a kind of persistent discourse, which was to say that Egypt had no water issues whatsoever. That is kind of like the political discourse, but of course this has shifted after the construction of the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. So now the discourse has in fact evolved, and there is much more conversation on the kind of use and the water consumption also for agriculture and urbanization. So I don't have the numbers, but I think it would be good to keep updated, because this is a kind of, let's say, evolving situation. And then the second question, the fear of the elevator. I think it's an interesting view. Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. There is definitely in kind of, let's say, the mode of habiting in more like, let's say, agricultural areas, not so much to live in like several in upper floors. So you could also say that this is not like the formerly farming population that have now moved into the city and have abandoned farming are not very do not trust elevators. That's just a general fact. It's also because they break down all the time. I mean, it's not only a kind of irrational fear of elevators, but they're actually quite, they're not super trustworthy. But I do believe that the people who buy the kind of things for let's say the housing for let's say securities are not people who would actually move there. So that is the kind of conversation about housing that is very interesting. I think also for us, if you think about it, is that usually when you build something as a speculator, you're expected to move in it to guarantee that it's a solid construction. So for instance, the big building that I showed, the kind of investor that was behind the construction, as soon as he would have reached a certain level of let's say completeness of his unit, would move in it to prove to whoever was going to buy some of the other units that it's safe and that you can trust that person. So everything that is bought just to be unhabitated is just pure money parking, basically. So the kind of upper floors of these areas, very often they remain unhabitated. Like people don't move in. To be a bit specific about that.
Great.
I have an additional question also, which also has something to do with what Nico asked. I was just wondering, you said that they are buying those apartments for like security reasons, but all those buildings are illegally built. So how secure is it then in the end to?
Very good question. Thank you. How are you also? I think that the kind of question of securities is related to the fact that people do not trust banks at all. So there is a kind of distrust of institutional financial systems, which means that people will never put money in the bank. So what do they do with that money? Also, people might have difficulties to be legally able to actually get a bank account, for instance, and things like that. So it means you have cash, and what do you do with that cash? And the best and the easiest way to actually save it is to buy a kind of some sort of real estate, or some form of real estate. Now, the fact that these buildings are illegal, you have to put in the context of the system that exists. It means you will own a property title. Again, we go back to that property title that will say that you own 1/24 of that plot. So you don't have, and there are also fake documents circulating as well, but you don't have, you have a paper, some sort of paper. Everyone who lives in this area have, I mean, to a certain extent, I would say an immense majority has some kind of tenure document, even if it's a fake one, even if it's ones that says that you own 1/74 of that plot. So people have some sort of security in terms of document. But this is very flimsy, of course, and it's related to the kind of unfairness of the situation where people cannot really access other forms of property. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, here the applause started. Great. So let's start with the applause. Let's thank Charlotte.
Thank you. It's always great to be able to share the research and also to discuss. And yes, so very nice.
Thanks. It was fantastic. And if you, I'm looking forward to this exercise. And
I wanted to share with you before I leave the document that I wrote with so I put it in the chat for those of you who want to read it.
Oh, fantastic.
Can I actually share it with, or is it too big? Let me see. Copy.
You can also send it to us, and we have a mailing list, and we can send it to everybody.
I think it's better if you send it to us, because now, I mean, we have more than 200 students inscribed in the course, and now there are only 100.
Okay, I'll send it to you. See, it's an interesting format. It's actually, because it's this 2038 scheme, they asked me to write it as the Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization. So it's my next job.
Fantastic. Yeah, 2038, it fits well.
I took office on 1st August 2030 as Director General of the FOA.
Fantastic.
Not pretentious at all. Anyway, fantastic. It's fun. It was a fun exercise. I'll email it to you, and then you guys can share it, and hopefully it kind of triggers some kind of discussion or anything like that.
Great. Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch, and
I'll join for
hopefully bring you again in the final let's say review, in this sense of literally a kind of a walk, to say so, of the most successful or interesting contributions.
Yes, that would be very nice. Of course.
That is the very last session. If you could remind me of the date, I think that's on.
I don't remember.
It should be maybe.
I don't have the poster in front of me, but I'll write you, and that would be fun, because then we could also do it together or comment together on some.
Yeah, no, of course I would love that. With pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks a lot,
thanks
everyone.
Everybody.
Have a good
See
day.
you next
Bye-bye.
time.
Bye-bye.